Hello everyone. Today we're going to start working on Period 5. Period 5 covers the steps to the Civil War all the way through Reconstruction. But today's lecture we're just going to focus on the first part of that, and that is the road to war and the war itself. To be able to be successful in almost any history class, you have got to have a certain set of skills, and one of those is to be able to put things in chronological order, whether it's absolute where you have dates, or it is relative to where you just have to know that this event happened here, then this event happened, then this event happened. And so today we're going to start off with the specific events that are going to start that boiling pot to bubble, and then to later on to make it bubble over. So the first thing on the timeline is going to be the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This is going to be where they bring in Missouri as a slave state, and then cut off part of Massachusetts and bring it in as a free state, and that way you have states coming in as pairs, one slave, one free, for the next little while. They're also going to outlaw slavery in the Louisiana Territory above the 3630 parallel. I have a map here that I would like to share with you. This is the expansion map, where by the time we get to 1853, we have all this territory from coast to coast. But the next map shows you where that Missouri Compromise line is. It's right here, and so everything above this red line here is going to have slavery outlawed, and that's an important key thing to remember as we get into this next compromise, which is the Compromise of 1850. With the Compromise of 1850, we now have all this territory over here, and this whole question about slave and free is going to bubble up again. And so what they're going to do with the Compromise of 1850 is they're going to bring California in as a state, flat out. It's going to be a free state. California is never going to be a territory. It's going to go straight from being a possession of Mexico to being a state in the United States. And then all this other area in here that we acquired from Mexico is going to be a territory, and they're going to be allowed to use popular sovereignty to determine if they're going to be slave or free. Well, the South is not real happy about this because they feel like it's going to give more weight to the free side than to the slave side. And so to appease the South, they're going to throw in a more strict Fugitive Slave Act, also in 1850, that is going to appease the South. With the new Fugitive Slave Act, they're going to not only punish the slave when it's caught and brought back, but they're also going to punish the perpetrator, the one who helped them get away, as well, trying to deter free people from helping the slaves escape. And that's going to make the South go, okay, we don't like it much, but we'll deal with it. And so that's going to rock along for about the next 5 years. But in 1855, you have Kansas ready to come in as a state. And so here is your Kansas territory, and Stephen Douglas, who is a senator from Illinois, is going to propose what becomes known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. By the time we get to this one, Henry Clay has passed on to his great reward. The last compromise that he will negotiate will be the Compromise of 1850. So Stephen Douglas is the one who proposes this Kansas-Nebraska Act, and they're going to divide this territory into Nebraska and into Kansas. And they're going to let them use popular sovereignty to determine if they're going to be a slave state or a free state. Now, if you remember, popular sovereignty is when the people get to vote about it. And the assumption is that Nebraska is going to come in as a free state, and Kansas will come in as a slave state. This pretty much is going to cancel out the Missouri Compromise. And I'll get back to this here in a little bit after I go through the whole timeline. Also, that same year, in association with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you're going to have the John Brown massacre that's also going to happen in Kansas. John Brown is going, and his followers are going to attack a pro-slavery town and hatchet 5 people to death. And once again, when I get back to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, I'll give you a few more details on that. Also in that year, you have got violence that's going to break out on the floor of the United States Senate. This cartoon right here is a depiction of a guy named Preston Brooks, that would be this guy right here, attacking Charles Sumner. Preston Brooks is a senator from South Carolina, and Charles Sumner is a senator from Massachusetts. And Charles Sumner stood up in Congress and basically insulted the entire South over slavery. And so Preston Brooks is going to take high offense at this and charge at him with his cane and practically beat the man just about to death. So much so that Charles Sumner will go back to Massachusetts to recover and won't really show back up in the picture until we get about halfway through the Civil War. And this is why Preston Brooks gets the nickname of Bully Brooks, because he's being a big bully. And so this particular cartoon is a slam at the South because of all, they're supposed to be known for their Southern chivalry and how, they're gentlemen and such, and they're using this idea of argument versus clubs, and the South is not even capable of using their words. They have to go to violence. And so this is all about the attack on the Senate floor over the insult of slavery. The next thing in 1857 is you're going to have the trial or the court case that concerns this man here. This is Dred Scott. Dred Scott's going to try and sue for his freedom in federal court. The actual name of the case is Scott v. Sanford, so make sure you kind of keep that together. And then the next thing you have is the elections of 1858, where these are called the midterm elections. And in the midterm elections, you have got Abraham Lincoln running against Stephen A. Douglas in Illinois for Senate. And they're going to have a series of debates debating the issues in about 7 different places around Illinois. Abraham Lincoln was known as the rail splitter. He could see both sides of an issue, and so that will really help him out once he becomes president. But in these series of debates, they become known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So if you have ever been involved in debate club or had to debate, you're probably very familiar with this style of debating because it will carry on as time goes by. And then in 1859, you're going to have John Brown show up again, and he and his compadres are going to attack the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. A federal arsenal is where they keep the weapons, and federal being, for the U.S. Army, okay? And he is going to be caught and tried as well as his followers, and he will be executed. And then in 1860, you're going to have the major election where Abraham Lincoln is elected president, and at that point, the South will secede. So that is your basic timeline of events running up to the Civil War. Now, I want to go back and spend a little time on some of the higher points. So let's go back to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, with the idea that Kansas was going to vote to be slave, both sides of the issue start sending people to live in Kansas so they can vote their side. And so a lot of Southerners are going to send Southerners, and a lot of Northerners are going to send Northerners, and they're going to put all these people in this state that have very, very passionate opinions about slave or anti-slave. It would be like putting two intensely rival football teams in the same locker room and closing the door. And you know as well as I do, it wouldn't take very long for violence to break out. And that's exactly what happens in Kansas. You have a pro-slavery group that is going to attack an anti-slavery town and burn the shops and tear the town up. And in retaliation, John Brown and his group are going to attack a pro-slavery town, Pottawatomie Creek, and that's when all those people get killed. And this is where Kansas, Nebraska gets the moniker of being Bleeding Kansas. So for the most part, war breaks out in Kansas 2 years before it breaks out every place else. And so that's why it's one of those key points in stirring up the conflict that is leading to the Civil War. The next one I want to go back and hit on is the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was a slave, and his master moved with him to a free state. I think they moved into Illinois, and they lived there for several years. And then the master dies. And so the slave, as was known to happen throughout the South, was left in the inheritance to the children of the man who was his master. And the children don't really want him as a slave. They understand his freedom, but it's not always proper for them to just turn slaves loose. And so Dred Scott is going to sue for his freedom in federal court. And it's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. At this time, a man named Roger Taney, Taney, was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And in the ruling for the Dred Scott case, first off, they're going to come back and tell Dred Scott, well, you don't need to be here to start with because you're not a citizen. You are property, and you do not have the right to sue in federal court. And then on top of that injury, they're going to, for the second time in U.S. history, rule legislation unconstitutional. They're going to come back and say that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, that the Congress had no authority to be able to outlaw slavery in the territories. Going back and looking at it later, in reality, they really did, but everybody took that Supreme Court decision. And so you're going to, with the Dred Scott case, you're going to wipe out the Missouri Compromise. And so this is going to start to take that gap that was about this big between North and South, and it's just going to drive a wedge through it to where by the time we get to the Civil War, it's a chasm between North and South that's going to be impossible to cross. Another one thing I want to talk about is in these debates right here between Lincoln and Douglas, there was one they held at a town called Freeport, Illinois. And at this particular debate, Lincoln is going to outright ask Stephen Douglas that, if you don't outlaw slavery in these territories, how are you going to keep it from spreading that way? And Douglas is going to come back and say, well, if the people don't really want it there, then no one in their right mind is going to take their valuable property someplace where the rest of the people aren't going to protect their property or try and get it back if it escapes. Which, I don't know. I mean, being a high school teacher and having been one for several years, I know how people are. How many students do you know have got a $1,000 iPhone? And they bring it to school with them, knowing full well that the school is not going to search for it or help them find it if it gets lost. And they will take it out and leave it on a desk and walk away. And so Douglas's argument really doesn't hold a lot of water. But that's what's known as the Freeport Doctrine, that people are not going to take their stuff, their property, someplace where the other people are not going to protect it. And then you have the election of 1860. Now, in this election, it's a four-way race. You've got the Republican Abraham Lincoln. You have the Democrats now that because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act have been split in two. You have the Northern Democrats led by Stephen Douglas, the Southern Democrats led by Breckinridge. And then you have an independent party, the Constitutional Union Party, that is being represented by a man named Bell. So it's a four-way split. Abraham Lincoln's name is not even going to be on a single ballot in the South. But so he's not going to get the majority. Well, he's going to get the most, but he's not going to get over 50% of the popular vote. So it's going to be the Electoral College vote that's going to make him president in the 1860 election. Now, when this happens, of course, the lower South is going to secede. So these states right here are all going to between December of 1860 and February of 1861, all these South states are going to secede from the United States. Now, an interesting side note about this. They're seceding because they're afraid that Abraham Lincoln is going to get rid of their slavery. Right? But Abraham Lincoln couldn't do that. As long as they were part of the United States, slavery was protected by the Constitution. And so a president can't just come in and toss out the Constitution and say, here, this is the way we're going to have it. So had they stayed, they would have had the protection of the Constitution. But they decided to secede, so therefore they lose that. And that's how you get this, war that's going to get started. The Crittenden Amendments are going to be proposed by a senator who, and this is basically the last ditch effort trying to save the Union before it all falls apart. And he's going to say, why don't we just take that Missouri Compromise line that's right here and draw it all the way over here to the Pacific coast, and everything above that line is going to be free, and everything below that line is going to be slave, and that'll make everybody happy. We're going to divvy up half and half. And Lincoln's going to go, no, that's not going to happen. And so he's going to reject that. So you have in April of 1861, Abraham Lincoln is going to let it be known that he is going to send provisions. And when you're talking about provisions, you're talking about clothing and food and medical supplies is what he was saying by provisions. And he's going to ship them down here to the federal fort at Charleston. It's called Fort Sumter. Well, the South is having none of this. This is deep, this is far down into South Carolina, and they're going to say, you're sending them weapons and stuff, and this is now our territory. And so as these ships get down here and get closer and closer, well, the opposing forts are going to fire on Fort Sumter. So if you've ever been to South Carolina, Fort Sumter sits in the middle of Charleston Harbor. It's been there since back in colonial times, okay? And then you have a fort over on one side, on the southern side of it, and you have a fort on the northern side, Fort Moultrie. And they're able to provide a crossfire, so it makes it very difficult for any kind of enemy to get into Charleston Harbor. So as these federal ships get closer, Fort Moultrie is going to start firing on them, and this is going to be the spark that sets off the Civil War. Now, there are going to be some people that may disagree with what I'm fixing to tell you, but there's always been this argument on whether or not the Civil War was fought over states' rights or whether it was fought over slavery, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. But I want to argue that it was really both. The northern states were trying to tell the southern states what to do, so states' rights, over the issue of slavery. So both sides have an argument here. But the trigger that sets it all off is going to be the attack on Fort Sumter. Now, you have to keep differences between what an attack is and what a battle is. So the first battle of the Civil War is going to come a little bit later. But the attack on Fort Sumter is what's going to trigger the actual war and get it started. Now that you have to talk about both sides. So let's talk about the differences between the North and the South, because they both have their good points and they both had their bad points. You have got in the North far more industry, far more railroad track. I mean, if you just look at this graph here, and the purple is all the stuff the Union has. So they far and away have a huge advantage in resources over the South, okay? But they also have a superior Navy. They have got a larger population. If you recall from period 4, when I was talking about immigration, your immigrants are coming and staying up here. They have no way, no desire to go down here because there are no jobs down here. You have people coming in that need wage labor, and they cannot compete against the free slave labor of the South. And so all your new immigration is going to hang up here, so you're going to have a lot more population in the North. You've also got, because it's the United States and it's been around for almost 100 years, it's got the stable economy, it's got the stable government, it's got the stronger military because it's been around longer. You've also got the more abundant food supply in the North. And you're going to go, huh? The South is agrarian. They've got all the agriculture. Why is the more abundant food supply in the North? Well, think about what the South grows. You've got tobacco, you've got cotton, You've got rice and you've got sugar. And I don't care how much rice and sugar you mix in with cotton and tobacco, neither one of them tastes very good. But up here in these southern states, these slave states that stayed with the North, you have got grains, you have got livestock, and so you've got a lot more food supply up here in the North, especially when you're talking about feeding a large group of people like soldiers. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that the North did not have their issues with disadvantages. One of their bigger disadvantages is that their military leaders stunk. It wasn't until Lincoln got a hold of Grant and Sherman that the tide finally turned for the North, and they started winning more and more battles. To start off with, the strategy ideas of the early Union generals really left a lot to be desired. And then they didn't have as much backing as you would think. I mean, most people in the North are like, just let the South go. If they want to keep their slaves, then let them. Why do we need to fight over keeping the Union together? Because that was the original stated purpose for going to war, was to preserve the Union. Okay? And so you have a lot of this divided support. You've also got your, people up in your textile mills and area that really don't have, are not really supportive of getting rid of slavery because they don't want their price of cotton to go up for raw materials. So you have this divided support going on up in the North. The South also has got their advantages. They are fighting for the most part on their home territory, and I'll show you maps about this in a little bit. These are country boys. They have been familiar with weapons since they were very, very young. They know the territory like the back of their hand because they play out in the woods, and they're fighting for their way of life. And so they are more passionate about why they are going to war. They also have got a much longer coastline. I'm going to go back up here to this map. So your South goes all the way down this way and up around that way. So it's going to be difficult for the North to blockade this much coastline. I mean, they'll finally get it done, but it's going to allow the South to be able to get out from in between them for the very first part, at least the first half of the war. And that's going to allow them to export their cotton, because that was their major cash crop. But they will run into a roadblock with this because right before the war, Harriet Beecher Stowe is going to write the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is about a slave girl named Eliza who is being persecuted by her master, Simon Legree, and how Uncle Tom is going to help her escape. And people over in Europe are going to get access to this book and read it, especially a woman named Queen Victoria. And it's going to change their opinion about who they want to support. And Queen Victoria is going to back away from supporting the South and lean more towards supporting the North. And this is when Great Britain finds other resources or other sources to get their cotton. This is when they start looking towards Egypt and towards India as a cotton source instead of the South. But the South also has got the more experienced military leaders. Probably the most premier military strategist at the time is going to be Robert E. Lee. If Robert E. Lee had had resources like the North had, the war may have come out a whole lot differently than it did, because he was a brilliant military mind. As you recall, when I talked about the Mexican-American War, a lot of your military leaders are going to gain their experience in fighting the Mexican-American War, and a lot of these guys are from the South. And so that's some of their advantages. But disadvantage-wise, they got a very small population. All this through here is all plantations and farms, so it's pretty much spread out everywhere. They have very little industrial base. These states right here will join the South in secession after the firing on Fort Sumter. And when Virginia decides to go with the South, that's when Robert E. Lee is going to go with the South. And so but you have industry right here. So you have the Trafalgar Iron Works that are in Richmond. Georgia's got some industry. There's something in an ironworks, I think, in Birmingham, Alabama. You might have some down around here in Louisiana. I mean, down here in New Orleans. But they don't have very much industry, where the North has the ability to make more weapons and create more clothing and all that industrial factory base that's in the North. And of course, the Confederate government has been around for 6 months, so it has not had a chance to get stable. It has not even had a chance to be able to gain financial support from other countries. And so that's going to be a hindrance. And by the time we get to the end of the Civil War, the Confederate soldiers are eating whatever they can catch, and that's including rats and bats and any kind of other rodent they get their hand on, because there is no way for the Southern government to be able to supply them. In fact, in some battles, they're throwing rocks at the Union because they've run out of bullets. And so that's your advantages and disadvantages between the North and the South. Now, before I get off of this map here, I want to show you where the border states are. So you have Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. And these are known as the border states. These are slave states that did not secede with the rest of the South. Okay, Virginia, is not even a state until the Civil War. When Virginia decides to secede, this part of Virginia over here is very mountainous. They don't really need slaves. This is where a lot of your coal mines are today. And so they're going to break away, and that's how we get West Virginia. And so the importance of the border states is knowing that they are Union states, but they are slave states, because it's going to impact how Lincoln does things in trying to get what he wants to get done accomplished without these 5 states also joining the South and him losing that territory and that advantage to the South. And so the border states are really, really important. Now let's talk about military leaders on both sides. You have got on the North, you have got McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, Grant, and Sherman are, the 5 of the big names. Yes, Winfield Scott started off as the leader of the North, but he's an old guy by this time, and he doesn't hang around very long. He retires, and McClellan is going to take his place. Now, like I said earlier, Lincoln's going to have a heck of a time getting these guys to press their advantage. McClellan was horrible about getting Lee exactly where he wanted him cornered and then letting him go. After Antietam, Lincoln's going to come down and basically have a come to Jesus meeting with him, saying, "Man, you got to fight. Stop letting him get away." Of course, the reason that the North barely won Antietam was because Lee decided to cut his losses and back up. He's a proponent of that idea of he who fights and runs away lives to fight another day. And so this would happen over and over and over. So finally, McClellan is taken out, and he's replaced by Burnside. Burnside's an interesting-looking fellow. He's got these big old mutton chops that they call them mutton chops. They look like little lamb chops, and they were big furry whiskers. And because of that, later on, when it becomes fashionable to keep hair right here without a beard, they're going to call him Sideburns. They're going to turn his name around and call him Sideburns. And then he's replaced by a guy named Hooker. Now, the story behind him is because he would allow ladies of the night to hang around his troops. They became known as Hooker's girls, and that's why we call prostitutes hookers. That's one of the stories. Now, sometimes some people like to say, no, that's not exactly true, but that's the story I've been told. And then Hooker's going to be replaced finally with Grant and Sherman. Grant and Sherman had spent the first part of the war fighting over on the western side, up in the Kentucky on the Ohio River and down into Mississippi. And so once he gets a hold of Grant, he wasn't exactly Lincoln's kind of guy. He was, rough around the edges, and he was a drinker and a rough talker, but he liked him because he was willing to fight, and he was willing to press the advantage. And with Sherman, they would be hard to stop. Okay, so those are your major Northern generals. And this is a picture right here of Grant. Right? Now this right here is Robert E. Lee. He was the leader of the Southern Army for the entire time, but he had help from a guy named Stonewall Jackson. Longstreet's another one. There's some others in there. Stonewall Jackson was head of his cavalry group. And Stonewall Jackson was really good about faking out the other side, especially McClellan and Burnside. He would start off with his smaller group of cavalry, which is guys on horseback, and make it be known that they were over here. Here we are, here we are. And then they would sneak around, and then here we are, and then sneak around, and here we are. And he would make McClellan or Burnside or Hooker think that they had a much larger force over there than what they really had. And the Union fell for it every single time until, of course, Grant got in there. Well, there's going to be an incident that's going to happen that's going to make that stop before even Grant gets there. At the Battle of Chancellorsville, Stonewall Jackson gets caught in crossfire and gets hit by friendly fire. And the bullet is going to go through his arm, and it's going to shatter the bone. Now, back during this time period, they did not have the ability to put pins in and fix bone the way we do today. And so if it hit bone like that, then your arm is amputated. Right up here, I have got, this is a surgeon's toolbox for the war. And so this is the instrument that was used for most amputations. They did not have anesthesia to a great extent. I mean, ether was around and some morphine, but it wasn't all, accessible by everybody out on the battlefield. And so Stonewall Jackson is going to be taken over to where they are doing surgery, and they are going to amputate his arm and throw it out the window into the pile of other limbs that have been amputated in that day's surgery. Well, his men adored him, and they find that that's his arm in that pile, and they pick it up and they take it about 100 yards or so away from where the hospital is, and they bury it, and they put a stone monument with Andrew Jackson's arm is here, engraved on it, right outside of Chancellorsville. And then after surgery, Stonewall Jackson's going to be taken 20 or 30 miles down the road to a house where he's going to be set up to recover, but he is going to catch pneumonia and he is going to die. So Stonewall Jackson is buried in two places. His arm is in Chancellorsville and the rest of his body is in his hometown. I think it's Lexington, Virginia. I can't remember. It starts with an L. Anyway, it's in his hometown. And so, but surgery during this time was really kind of scary. Now, an interesting thing about Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee inherited slaves from his father when his father died. But Robert E. Lee didn't believe in slavery. The only reason he went with the South is because Virginia went with the South. So as soon as he gets these slaves, he is going to release them and set them free. On the other hand, Ulysses S. Grant also is given slaves in an inheritance, and it's going to be 3, 4, 5 years before he sets them free. So it's, kind of interesting backstories about the juxtaposition of things. Now, Lincoln is going to try and fund the war by increasing tariffs and a temporary income tax. It's not the income tax like we have today. The 16th Amendment doesn't get passed until 1915, that time, right around that time period. And so, but that's how they're going to raise money to fund the war. But he also has to gather up men to fight. We don't have a large standing army at this time like we have today. And so he is going to establish they're going to pass the federal draft law. And so they're going to use conscription to draft people into the military. But at this time, it was possible for wealthy boys to be able to pay poor boys to go and fight for them. And that's why a lot of times you might hear that the Civil War was a rich man's war fought with a poor boy's blood. Because these rich boys would just pay, $300 or $400, $500 for these poor boys to go and fight for them. And also it's going to cause a lot of aggravation, conflict, and everything up in the north because, like I said earlier, that they're not real big supporters of this war. And so you're going to have draft riots break out. Up in New York City. This is one where they're lynching a Negro in New York City because they're angry about fighting this war and why do we have to fight this and why can't you just let them go? And so Abraham Lincoln is going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Now, the writ of habeas corpus means that the authorities cannot arrest you and keep you in jail for more than 3 days without charging you with something. If they can't charge you with something, they have to let you go. Well, when Lincoln suspends the writ of habeas corpus, all these rioters that get arrested because of these draft riots are going to spend the rest of the war in a jail somewhere so they don't cause any more trouble. If you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, there is a scene in there that is all about the draft riots. Now, one of the strategies that the North is going to use to defeat the South is known as the Anaconda Plan. I'm just going back to this one map so I can show you the whole thing. But they want to naval blockade all this area here. They want to gain access to the Mississippi River because the Mississippi River joins up with the Ohio. And so if they can get control of all of this, then they can, like an anaconda snake, they can strangle the South. And so that's why it was called the Anaconda Plan. And so in your notes, I've given you a map that kind of gives you a lot of what I've just shown you as far as North and South border states and stuff like that, trying to give you a visual on, what was going on. Now, let's talk about the major battles. I'm not going to give you a whole bunch of them, but most of the war is going to be fought over in the Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina area, over on the eastern side. So your first major battle is the Battle of Bull Run, but it's also known as the Battle of Manassas. It just depends on if you're referring to the town Manassas or if you're referring to the creek that runs beside it, Bull Run. And so if you'll notice, Manassas is right here. It's only about 25 miles from Washington, D.C. So it's pretty close for people to come and watch what's going on. And that's what the Washington people are going to do. They're going to pack up picnic baskets and get in their carriages and go out here, and they're going to sit on the side of the hills and try and watch this battle much like you would watch a football game. But the battle is going to go different. I mean, they think that the Union is fixing to, wallop the Confederates at this battle. But it turns the other way. The Confederates kick hind end and take names. And so the Washington citizens are going to flee back to Washington, D.C. with their hair on fire just about because they're terrified that the Confederacy is fixing to overrun the capital. Now, I have been to Manassas. Because I've been to almost all the Civil War battlefields that are over in this area throughout in here. And I wanted to see where these people were sitting to watch this battle. Well, they put a Walmart there, so you can't really see it. Another place I wanted to see was the McClellan estate. Now, not McClellan, McLean estate. Now, McLean owned a property here in Manassas. And so much so that the war, this battle was fought in his front yard in a lot of cases. And that's what a lot of people don't understand about the Civil War. It was fought in your front yard, over in your neighbor's field, over in the downtown streets. It was like up close and personal. And so McLean did not like the fact that this war was being fought in his front yard, and so he's going to pick up his family and he's going to move and buy property down over here southwest of Richmond in a town called Appomattox. Well, 4 years later, that's where Lee is going to surrender to Grant. So with the McLeans, it said that the Civil War starts in his front yard and ends in his front parlor. So I wanted to see the McLean house. Oh no, they've got a McDonald's there. So the Manassas battlefield is not as well preserved as some of the others that I've gotten to see. But that's known as the first major battle, and it is a Confederate win. The next big item on the list is one that happens right down here. This is Hampton Roads. It's the entrance into the Chesapeake Bay. And this is important because it's the first time that you're going to have ironclad or ironside ships fighting each other. They have taken iron sheets and put them along the sides of these wood ships to protect the sides of them. And so you have the Merrimack and the Monitor that are going to wage war with each other. It's pretty much a draw. The South wants to say that they won this one because the Monitor, limps off first, but the Merrimack also limps off, and neither one of them see battle anymore. The biggest significance of this is that it's the first time that we have metal-sided battleships at each other. And then you have the Battle of Antietam. Now, Antietam is way up here in Maryland. The importance of the Battle of Antietam is that not only does it have the single bloodiest day of the war, but it was a narrow Union victory because Lee decides to back up and move away. And so because it was considered a victory, this is going to give Abraham Lincoln the victory he needs to be able to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. He didn't want to do it on a Union loss because everybody would go, well, why are we doing this? So he waited till we got a victory, and so this is when he's going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. But let's look at this. The Emancipation Proclamation only frees the slaves still under Confederate control. Okay, so these slaves up here do not get freed. So in reality, it doesn't really free anybody, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have any impact. Okay. The reason why he doesn't free the slaves up here is because he doesn't want this group up here to secede. Okay? But what it's going to do is it's going to cause slaves down here to, in larger numbers, escape to the north. That's how we're going to be able to get the Massachusetts 54th, and how you're going to find contraband. So these are freed slaves that are going to travel with the Union Army, and they're going to help out in any way they can because they're getting protection from the Union Army. But it's also going to take the Civil War that was initially said to be fought to preserve the Union and keep the country together, is now going from that to being a war to end slavery. And it's going to give it a moral cause, which is going to make more people get behind it. And so it's going to change it to be a humanitarian effort, and so therefore people are more apt to support the war effort now because of what it stands for. So that's the importance of Antietam, and then of course the Emancipation Proclamation. In 1763, you have got the Battle of Vicksburg. The Battle of Vicksburg happens the same weekend as the Battle of Gettysburg that's right up here in Pennsylvania. Okay, so Vicksburg sits right here on the Mississippi River, and it sits on the high ground. And there's a bend in the river, so they got good vantage point on any direction people are coming down the river. And Grant and Sherman are having a devil of a time trying to get the upper hand at Vicksburg. So Grant is going to do an end around. He's going to go through Louisiana and down under Vicksburg and cross the Mississippi further south. And then he's going to come over here in Jackson and meet up with Sherman, and they're going to lay siege to Vicksburg until Vicksburg finally collapses. At the same time, you have the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, Gettysburg is the bloodiest battle of the war. So it ran over 4 days. The bloodshed was horrendous. This is where Pickett's Charge is. This is where you have Little Round Top and Devil's Den, where the Union had the advantage up here on the top of Little Round Top, shooting down on the Confederates here in Devil's Den. Right beside it is this little narrow creek, and it becomes known as the slaughter pen because as the Confederates are trying to escape, the Union is just picking them off. And so there is just an enormous amount of bloodshed. The time I was there was on, I think it was like a day before the 4th of July, and all the reenactors were there getting ready to reenact the Gettysburg battle. Now, a year later, this is where Abraham Lincoln is going to make the Gettysburg Address. 7 years ago, our forefathers. That's the Gettysburg Address. And so but the important though thing about the Vicksburg battle is that it is going to divide the South. So the Union has got control of the Mississippi River, so they've completed their Anaconda Plan, and now you have this part of the South separated from this part of the South. It basically, the South lost the war at Vicksburg because of the split between the two. Yeah, there was lots more battles, but Vicksburg is really important in this case. Now, another spot that is important is right over here in Tennessee, and this is going to happen in 1864. Sherman is going to come out of Chattanooga and march down into Georgia. Let me find you this other map here. This is Sherman right here. And he's going to come down here. He's going to get a hold of Atlanta, and he's going to burn Atlanta to the ground. If you've ever seen the movie Gone with the Wind, that's the last scene. Although that scene was filmed first, so they burnt the back lot at Warner Brothers to film that scene. But they're depicting the burning of Atlanta. And then he and his troops are going to cut a 300-mile swath all the way down to Savannah, destroying everything they can along the way. If you can trace your heritage, your ancestry, back through this part of the South, you're going to find it very difficult to find birth records and marriage records and stuff like that, because they're going to torch every single courthouse they can torch. They're going to make it down here to Savannah right about Christmas time, because he's going to telegram Lincoln and give him Savannah for Christmas. And then after Christmas, he's going to turn north. Now, Sherman believed that South Carolina started this war. And so he was intending to make South Carolina howl. And he is going to ransack this state all the way across it. I mean, the destruction this way was nothing compared to the destruction across South Carolina. When he gets to North Carolina, it eases up. It doesn't go away, of course, but it's significantly less destruction when he gets to North Carolina. He is headed up this way to meet up with Grant at Petersburg. At Petersburg, you can see trenches, some of the first trenches, how they're going to model some during World War I after the trenches in Petersburg. It's also where the crater is. The crater is where the Union tunnel underneath the Confederate positions and load it with dynamite and blow it up. It didn't get as much effect as they wanted it to get, but it was still pretty catastrophic. There's still a big old crater there, you can see it. And so the battles around here is what's finally going to force Sherman, I mean not Sherman, but Lee to surrender right here at Appomattox Courthouse. And that's going to be the end of the Civil War for the most part. Yes, there's still going to be skirmishes here and there because communication is still not great, but the Appomattox Courthouse is where they're going to sign the surrender papers between Lee and Grant. Now, the economy during the war is in the North is going to go up. Unfortunately, war is good for the economy. It creates jobs. If people have jobs, they have money. If they have money, they spend it. And money is what greases the economic wheels. And so northern industries are going to increase. They are going to also, but it's also going to increase the number of women that are going to be out of the house doing things. Now, women are going to serve as nurses, but they're also going to serve as factory workers, government clerks. Some are going to serve as spies. One of the most famous women of the time period is going to be Clara Barton, who is the one who starts the American Red Cross. She is working out in the field and in the surgical areas, and she notices that the surgeons will be operating on this one guy and finish with him, pick up a towel, wipe off their hands, and put their hands back into another patient without any kind of real sanitary cleansing of their hands. And that, of course, creates infection and gangrene and all this other stuff. And so she is one of those that's going to start the ball rolling on, sanitation and improving those kinds of things so that people can survive their wounds. Because, I mean, there are probably as many guys that are going to die from infection of their wounds and gangrene that are going to die from just being killed outright. It's also going to increase the power of the federal government. I mean, that's a pretty powerful move when you suspend the writ of habeas corpus, and he doesn't do it once, he does it twice because of disloyalty. But you've also going to have blacks in the war. They're going to, by the time we get to the end of the war, you've got 180,000 blacks that enlisted into the Army in separate. Now, yes, they're in segregated units, but they've enlisted in the Army. There are 24,000 that are in the Navy. Of course, the most well-known is the Massachusetts 54th. If you ever get a chance to see the movie Glory, it's all about this group. It stars Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman, and Matthew Broderick, and it is an excellent movie about this valiant group of soldiers who sacrificed their lives to be able to fight in this war for their freedom. Now, before I get away, I want to talk real quick about these two men right here. Because I haven't really given you a lot of backstory on Abraham Lincoln as far as president. He's elected in 1860, so he serves from 1861 to 1865. As we've already talked about, he's a Republican from Illinois, and he is a moderate. He tries to find that middle ground so that there's something that each side can take away from it, so it causes less conflict later on. Some things that happen while he's president that don't always get a lot of notice. The Homestead Act is passed while he's president. This will be dealt with a little more in depth when you get into History 1302, but this is how we're going to be able to settle the Great Plains with the Homestead Act. He's also going to use what's known as the pocket veto. The pocket veto is where when Congress passes a law in the last 10 days of a congressional session, and it goes to the president to either sign off on or veto, and the president does nothing with it, leaves it on its desk, sticks it in his pocket, does nothing with it, then it's automatically vetoed. And that's what Lincoln's going to do with the Wade-Davis bill. The Wade-Davis bill was a counter Reconstruction plan to Lincoln's Reconstruction plan that he came out with in 1863. But Lincoln, unfortunately, is going to be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, and that's what this center depiction is. John Wilkes Booth is going to sneak into the Ford's Theater where Lincoln and his wife and friends are watching a play and shoot him in the back of the head, and he's going to die the next day. There are, yes, a lot of coincidental things that go between the Lincoln assassination and the Kennedy assassination. Both men were assassinated by someone who uses all three of their names. So John Wilkes Booth, Lee Harvey Oswald. John Wilkes Booth is going to shoot him in a theater and run to a warehouse. Lee Harvey Oswald shoots Kennedy in a warehouse, runs to a theater. So, I mean, you can look it up. There's a whole long list of the coincidental things that go between these two assassinations. But with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, who was a very polished politician, you're going to get this guy right here. This is Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is from Tennessee. He is going to assume the presidency on the death of Lincoln and finish out Lincoln's second term. He is a Republican from Tennessee, and he's picked as Lincoln's running mate in his second term because he was the only one from the congressional group from Tennessee that didn't secede when Tennessee did. And so Lincoln was looking for that go-between, that person that could help him bring the South back after the war. Because that was always his intent, is once this war is done, we're going to be able to heal the nation and bring everything back. Well, the only reason that Andrew Johnson didn't secede with the rest of them is because he was a poor white farm boy, and he didn't like the planter aristocracy of the South. And if we could go to war and get rid of their slavery, well, that would give them some comeuppance. It wasn't that he was, really benevolent toward the slaves. He just was trying to get back at the planter aristocracy. And so you have this man who had no formal education whatsoever, and what he had learned as far as reading and writing, he'd either taught himself or had learned, at homeschooling of some sort. He also was very intolerant of any kind of criticism. And you know those people who can't take even, constructive criticism. They just blow up. Not He wasn't able to find that middle ground like Lincoln was. And so he is going to be a stumbling block and a barrier to Reconstruction as it tries to move forward. He was deeply racist. It was, one of those things of, oh, it was okay for all those black people to have their freedom as long as they kept it down there and did not come up here and mix in with his group up here closer to the north. And so it's going to cause a lot of issues as we start stepping off into Reconstruction. So next time we're going to talk about Reconstruction and the events that bring us to trying to put the country back together. And so until then, I'll see you later. Bye.